Welcome. This is the third part of this video series, and in this part we're going to talk about the application management features of that DevOps platform that I shared the last time. And just like last time, this video will have two parts. There's first a show and tell part where we're just kind of using that platform, and then the second part, if you're interested into a deep dive into the code and how that code works, stick around for that. All right, up next is we have to deploy our application. The last time there was multiple steps to deploy the application. We're going to do it in one step. So I'll show you that in a little bit. But in this one step, we're going to deploy the web. We're going to deploy the workers, which is supervisor D and Redis. We're going to deploy the scheduler, which is the cron tab. And we're also going to just go ahead and make it so it's running on MySQL instead of SQLite. And if you recall, we're going to go real quick. Here's all the details that are in here. This is all going to be in that code. We're going to review the code after we do the install, but we'll show you the install first. So again, these are deploy the worker steps. Here's the deploy the scheduler steps. Here's migrating from MySQL steps, like creating the database and the user. We'll see all of those. All right, to start this off, first thing is I want to look at some aliases that were automatically created for us. And you can see 4 of them. There's appList, appNew, appCreate, appDelete. We're going to use all 4 of those, and I'm not going to dive into the code and what they mean, but we're just going to use them as if we're just using some application. So that's what we're going to do first. So first of all, appList will list all the installed applications. We don't have any at this point, so there's nothing really to show here. And so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to run something called appNew. Think about it like a form. We're going to answer some questions. It's going to gather some information, and it's going to create a config file for us. So we're going to go ahead and fill this out. If you recall, the ports that I had open is I had port 80 open. So I'm going to use port 80. We also had 8000, 8001, 8002. We'll use those in a little bit. I'll show you how we use them. So the GitHub repo, I'm going to copy and paste the repo in. That's the same repo that we've been using all along. And then this public SSH key, we are going to copy and paste this key in also. And so you can see appNew, it asks a bunch of information. We provide that data. And then at the end, it says it's created some new.sh. So it's created a shell script for us. So we're going to review that config. We're going to look at it together. And then after that, we're going to run the appCreate command. So first, let's look at what's happened right now. There is a new directory called apps. You can see that here. Inside of apps, we will see a demo_1, which is what just got created for us. And if we look at that, and this is all the information that it asks us for, with the exception of this one. So there's an app_type. It's called Laravel right now. It's hard-coded in. My plan is to maybe have different apps that have different build steps. Like Laravel has a certain build step. You know, you composer install, npm install, php, artisan migrate. But maybe if it's like a Python, then it's not the same build step. So I have this variable called appType, which we can have pluggable kind of builders, and we'll talk about that more when we get to the code. But for now, this is what our configuration looks like. So after running appNew, we just have a config file, and that's it. Next thing is we run appCreate, and we tell it which config file or which user we want it to create. And again, I'm going to just let this run, and we'll review the code that actually gets run in just a little bit. So after this completes at a high level, you can see it created a new user called Demo1, and it added a Demo1 user group, and it went through all of those steps that we did before. It created GitHub keys so that we can have a deployment key for GitHub. In fact, it even catted it out for us. So we can copy this right now, and you could take it over to your GitHub repo or your Bitbucket repo, wherever you're at, and then you can paste in as a deployment key. It added www-data to the user group demo1. And if you recall, this was one of the permission issues that we had the last time. And then it created an initial.env file for us. So the steps, it even gives you the steps here. So step number 1 is copy and paste this, put it in your GitHub repo. We're not going to do that because this is a public repo, and I don't really need a GitHub key to pull, but if it was a private repo, you would need a deployment key to actually do a git clone or anything. So we are going to just do a quick review of this .env file. So right now it's under /home/demo. So it's part of the demo1 user. So we are going to sudo demo_1. And then what we're going to do is we want to go look at this file in the deployments folder. And so here's our Laravel.env. This is the standard .env file. I didn't change much, but here's where you have an opportunity. If you have additional information that you want to put in your .env, like, I don't know, keys to some API that you're using or something like that, you want to drop them in here now. Down here, you'll see a couple of changes. First of all, the database connection. You can see it's already kind of primed with demo_1, demo_1 secret. This is the information that I entered before. We are using Redis for our session. We're also using Redis for our queue, and we're using Redis for our cache. And this is the configuration we need for Redis. We didn't change that. And the only other thing I'll point out here is there's this new environment variable called app_version, which is going to be managed by the deployment scripts. So every time you deploy, it will fill a new version in here for you. So that way you can display whatever version you're at on your application, so you can see the version. So we're going to exit out and we're going to go back to our Ubuntu user. All right, so pass one, we ran through pass one. We installed our SSH scripts over at GitHub. We reviewed our .env file. Next thing is we rerun appCreate one more time. And this time we'll get different information. Okay, so that's completed. Let's go back to the top and review what it did. So this time, obviously, it did some new stuff. So here's the very top. We ran this the second time. It didn't create that user again because it was already there. It did add that public SSH key that we created as part of the new app. It put that authorized key, so now I should be able to SSH in as that demo_1 user. So I can do something like this right here. Next thing it did is it added a new alias to bash aliases for this demo user. We'll take a look at that. This alias is called deploy. We'll take a look at that in a little bit. Updated MySQL, so it created a database called demo_1 and it added a demo_1 user. And then it started an initial deployment. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of the details about the deployment. They won't make sense yet. In a little bit, we're going to look at the directory structure and kind of more under the hood of how this all works. But for now, we're just going to kind of gloss over. We're going to come back. We're going to go over it again. It'll make more sense maybe the second or third pass here. So creating the initial development, starts a deployment. It creates a new folder called that, which is just the current timestamp or whatever you ran at. And then it get cloned into that directory. And then it's running our Laravel builder. Again, I talked about having maybe different builders. You know, this is Laravel, but maybe there's a Python one or the Django one or whatever it is. As part of the Laravel builder, we're going to create these symlinks. We'll talk about symlinks. It'll make more sense in a little bit. But here's composer install. This is familiar. So we ran composer install the last time. After composer install, there's npm install. And then we ran our migrations. This is the first pass. So none of these tables existed. So all the migrations ran. And then we built the front end assets using Vite. Here's where there's some code that sticks in the app version in that .env file. And then we activate this new release. And we'll talk about what that activation means in a second. But here is kind of the new link. And then finally, as part of the deployment, it does a little bit of cleanup. And again, this will make more sense in a little bit. Because it's our first run, it creates the application key for us. More symlink code. And again, we'll talk about symlinks in a second. This will make more sense. But .env is symlinked in. The public cache is symlinked in. Public data, storage, and the database.sqlite are all symlinked in. Recreates the symlinks. Then it starts doing some of the other things that we talked about, like creating cron tab scripts. So here's the cron tab script. The first thing it does is it changes directory into this user's deployment current directory. And And we'll see what that means in a little bit. But this cron tab is specific for this deployment. So it's going to run this PHP artisan command in that current deployment. Creates the nginx conf. So this is very specific for this application. We'll take a look at that in a bit. It creates that PHP pool. We did exactly the same thing. We had to do these steps, and this was to fix some permission issues. So on files and things. And then finally, it creates a supervisor conf. All of those things it did automatically for us. We had to do all of each one manually before. So now, if I do appList, I should have one. So I got my demo_1. So I go here and I click refresh on our IP address. Now we see our Laravel application. At the very bottom, I'm going to scroll down. You can see the app version. This is that same app version that we saw in the terminal window. So it's just displayed in our application. And then there's also a /horizon path. And you can see here we have /horizon. And there's already been 22 jobs that have been running. So we know that the cron tab's working and supervisor's also working. So everything is functioning here for this application. One benefit of having all this code that creates our infrastructure is we can run this again. So for example, I can do appNew and I can say demo2. I'm going to run this on port 8000, and we're just going to use the same GitHub repo, and we'll put that same SSH public key in there, and it created that config file. I'm not going to review it. It looks exactly the same, except for demo1_1 is replaced by demo_2. But now we can say appCreate demo_2. It'll go through the same gyration as it did before. It's going to create everything for us. That's the first pass. I rerun the command again. This is the second pass where it's actually getting a build now. All right, so now it's completed. And if I list out my apps, I get 2 apps. And if I duplicate all of these, but switch from port 80 to port 8000, we are loading up demo_2. And you can see the version is slightly different than this one. This one was deployed a little bit earlier. So demo2 is deployed a little bit later. We can see that. Let's make sure Horizon's working. And so here's Horizon. And you can see the jobs are different, right? Because they should have their own queues. They're not the same queue. It's a run in different queues. So this one hasn't had an opportunity for the cron tab to schedule something yet. So once a minute, it'll schedule something. Maybe at the top of the minute, it hasn't run yet. There you go. So it just changed right now. And so now there's been one job running and it's been completed. So we know cron tab, supervisor, all working. And just like I spun up demo2, you could spin up demo3 on port 8001, demo4 on port 8002. But we can also do the opposite. We can delete an app. So to do that, I can use appDelete, and I just have to provide it with the name of the application. So we're going to delete _2, and it gives me a confirmation. Are you sure you want to do this? It's going to delete all of this stuff, which is backing out everything we did to create it. And we're going to say yes, and we're going to let it run. Okay, so now it's completed. So now if I pull this in, this is the port 8000 Horizon. If I refresh, that's no longer available. Here's the port 8000 just web. That's no longer there. However, my other one, which is demo_1, is still available. So just to recap before we end this one, there's the 4 new commands. appList, list out all the applications that you've installed. appNew takes you through a form and asks you a bunch of questions, and then it creates a config file for the application. appCreate takes that config file and it does everything that we did last time manually to set it up. So an nginx conf, PHP FPM pool comps, supervisor, cron tab, and actually does it in a deployment also and gets everything ready for you. And it does that in 2 passes. The first pass, it allows you to install your SSH keys into whatever Git repo that you have so you can do a deployment. You can review your .env file and make sure that all your information in there is what you want it to be. And then the second pass, it does all the work. And then appDelete, you can back anything out you want. So with this platform, managing my applications, it becomes pretty easy. I have 4 commands. I can manage everything that I need to manage. All right, so now let's take a moment and just look at some of the deployment code that we just used. So it's all under the deploy directory here. And again, this is in that DevOps directory. We're just using PyCharm to kind of look at it all here locally on my computer. So under the deployment directory, let's look at the different commands. So we saw appList, that's right here. So list apps. And that command, uses shell script. So it's a bash script. And down here, we're actually getting a list of all of the applications or all of the files that are in this apps directory, and we're just displaying that out. That's all it does. So this command is just showing you what's in that apps directory. So here's the appNew command. So it's going to go through and ask us all the questions that we saw earlier. Enter the deployment user, enter passwords, confirm the password, enter the Git repo, enter the SSH thing. And then after it gets done with that, it takes this template, which is _app, which you can see right here. And it takes that template, uses some sed commands on it to kind of complete it up. But then after that, you have a new config file in the apps directory. The next command that we used was appCreate, and that's here, create app. And there's not a lot of surprises here either. If you followed along in the previous video where we did this manually, it's just everything is one file. So we run this one command and we can get our application created. So it is expecting one command line parameter, which was the username that we're installing. And I'm not going to dig into all these different sources. We're going to stay at kind of a high level, and then you can go and dig around if you want. So this actually loads the config file for the application, that user. So demo_1.sh, it loads that up. So we have access to all of those variables that we created earlier. Here's where we start to create the user. So we ran this command, sudo add user. This is exactly the same thing that we did when we did this manually. Created the GitHub deployment keys, SSH keygen. We did all this manually. And it created this config file because remember we chose this name for our GitHub key, which is GitHub_RSA, which isn't the ID_RSA, which it normally looks for. And so this config file is telling it that anytime you get something for GitHub, go ahead and use this key. Updated the permissions on that directory so that it all functions. Here's where we actually cat it out so that you can actually see the key and copy and paste it and put it in GitHub. Adding that new group to www.data, which was one of the permission issues that we ran into, we had to fix last time. And finally, here's where it's creating a .env file for us. And how this bits are working is we are copying this local Laravel.env file, which you can see right here. So this is just a template. It has all of the things that you normally would see. And then the only thing I changed was I added this new variable, app_version. And then here's a bunch of sed commands that are setting the actual values that we want in here. Now that we know what the username is and the DB password, and we know the Horizon prefix. So every Horizon instance needs a prefix so that all the jobs show up in their own particular queues. And then that's the end of pass number 1. So when you run appCreate, that's pass number 1. Now you can go and you can do your thing. So when you run it for pass number 2, then we're going to get to all of this other stuff. Here's where we use that public key and we create this authorized keys. We did this manually the last time. Here's where we're creating a new alias for this user called deploy. And we're going to look at deploy in a little bit here, but just know that that alias is there. Updating MySQL. We're actually creating the database and creating the user and hooking the privileges up so that that user can access that database. Doing our initial deployment. Again, this is where all of the code we use the Laravel builder and we do composer install, npm install. That's all down in this script. We're not going to go further than this level, but this is where that deployment happens. Here's where we generate the key. It's our first application run, so we're going to create a key. And now we start some of this symlink stuff. And again, symlinks are going to make more sense when we look at the deployment video. So there's a video after this that we're going to look at where we're doing specifics of deployment, and we'll take a look at that structure. setting up the cron tab for the user, setting up nginx conf for this particular application. And you can see we're using another template here. nginx conf is right here. And so this is the template that we're using, and then we're just using the sed commands again to change some things. In particular, like for example, the root path, it will now be the deployment directory, which would be like /home/demo_1/deployment/current/public. And we'll find out current is a symlink here in a little bit. So that's kind of one of the secrets to making this work. Creating the PHP FPM pool conf. And creating the supervisor conf. So all of that's done automatically for us now. So we did this manually previously. Now when we run create app or appCreate, it's automatically done. And then finally, here's delete app. So delete app is kind of running create app in reverse. So it expects an argument, and after that, it does a confirmation here. You know, you're about to delete, please confirm. If you click confirm, it enters here, and then it starts to burn down things or tear things down in the opposite order. So nginx conf, and then it takes down the PHP FPM pool, and then supervisor, and then deleting the cron tab. So it removes the group from the www-data user. So it drops the user and the database from MySQL. And then finally down here, it deletes all of the user files. It uses this -- to remove all files. It does a kind of a complete search for anything that user might have put on the system. And just to make sure that it caught everything, why even do an extra -rf, remove that user's home directory. And then the last thing it does is it deletes the config file for that application.